All right, well, welcome everybody to our latest session on ORG 448 Emerging Markets. Today's session is going to talk a little bit about macroeconomic trends in emerging markets. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Frank-Jürgen Richter to this program to share a few of his insights and comments about emerging markets. And as a way of getting started, I want to briefly introduce Dr. Richter. He is currently the chairman of Horasis and also the founder of the Horasis Global Meetings. He was a former director of the World Economic Forum from 2001 to 2004. And I should say that our paths crossed early in the 2000s back in South Korea. I don't remember the exact setting anymore, except that it led to a book that was published in 2005, Korea Confronts the Future, that was co-edited by John Barry Koch and Frank-Jürgen Richter. And I was fortunate enough to have a book chapter in there. And over the years, we sort of kept in touch, and I was fortunate to be invited to some of the Horasis Asia meetings. And I'm sure if you would like to talk a little bit about that, that would be great. Dr. Richter has a degree in industrial engineering from the University of Karlsruhe. He did academic stays in France and Mexico, pursued PhD studies at the University of Tsukuba, and earned his doctoral degree from the University of Stuttgart. With that, welcome, Frank-Jürgen. It's great to see you again. And as a way of getting started, I would invite you to maybe share a little bit about Horasis. What is Horasis all about? What's the vision? What's the mission statement? And then we'll take it from there.
Thanks so much, Francis, and thanks for inviting me. Time is flying since we met, I think, almost 20 years ago in Korea. And at the time, people even talked about Korea as an emerging market. We know, of course, Korea emerged like many other countries. And we see a shift in power, between emerging markets and the established countries of the West. And that's maybe, the arena Horasis is working. We are connecting countries. We connect people with different opinions. We are nurturing dialogues. So what we are doing, we host large-scale summits a bit all over the world. Prior to Corona, I have to say, of course, we can't host meetings those days. But we host meetings on China, India, Southeast Asia. We host a global meeting, and currently we're working also on an Africa summit. So we are always inviting heads of government, ministers, and CEOs, entrepreneurs to share the platform and to talk about the future. Our vision, actually, and our mission is to inspire the future. We want to come up with solutions how to improve the state of the world and to advance the global public good. We very much believe in private-public partnerships. We believe that entrepreneurs should always think about the long term in a way how capitalism works, giving back to society, even has a bit of an altruistic mindset. And with Corona, we nurtured our own digital transformation. Now we are hosting our summits online. Just around 4 months ago, we hosted a big summit on the digital sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres attended. We had 5 heads of states, many leading entrepreneurs, including Richard Branson. And I'm very glad that you have been part of our meetings, Francis, and I look forward to your participation in our next meeting, which is focusing on the US on the 18th of March. And it's the first time we are hosting a meeting on America. And this maybe brings us back to emerging markets in some way, because we see that America is still the leading superpower in the world, but its kind of power and influence is waning, especially in the last 4 years, with a president in power at the White House who wants to make the country great again, but sometimes on the expense of its trading partners, especially Europe, but also Asia and also the emerging countries. There's a conflict between US and China. People say we move from a trade war to a tech war. It's really a war for influence and, who holds or who is really ahead in terms of artificial intelligence, blockchain, anything digital. So it's a very interesting world. If you look into emerging countries on the one hand and the established countries of the West on the other hand. Yeah, so that's where we are. And I guess you have many other questions, so please go ahead. And I think it's great to have a bit of a dialogue and to learn also from you, Francis, because you're a very seasoned professor and academician.
All right. Well, since you mentioned China already, let me maybe start with that country. A country that recently, actually, according to Bloomberg's latest categorization of the top emerging markets, interestingly enough, was only on number 17, which was quite surprising. The top two were Thailand and followed by Russia, and that was also, I think, somewhat surprising. But when you look at China today, especially in the context of not necessarily post COVID-19 just yet, but with that in mind, and the slowdown in the Chinese economy over the years, what's your take on the prospects in China? What are the challenges that China is facing as an emerging market? If we can still look at it as emerging, some might say it has already more or less emerged. It's definitely, as you mentioned, a peer competitor in the technology realm now with the US, where we are more or less engaged in that tech war. But what do you see as the prospects or the challenges for a country like China?
Well, China got already its new normal, and let's use this expression coined by President Xi Jinping. The new normal started already some 3, 4, 5 years ago, when China's growth rates went down from double-digit first to 7%, now to 5%, and even lower now with COVID. But it's a reduction in growth, but it's an increase in the quality of growth, because China is now very much focusing on its own intellectual property. In the past, people said, China is just copying, it's a copycat. And there has been a lot of fear that China is kind of, getting into the market with cheap products and destroying industries in the West. Now they say, now China is a top innovator, and it's even more dangerous. And we have companies in the telecom area like Huawei, which are world leaders in the next generation in 5G technologies, in AI, likewise. And China is everywhere when it comes to tech. Even in terms of e-commerce, China is leading already. I think also digital payments. If you take Alipay, for example, and other similar products, China is definitely leading in the world. When you go to China, even like on the countryside, and get some renminbi in your pocket, you can't really use it anymore in restaurants, right? You have to use Alipay. And it's quite striking, the way how China advanced. But in a nutshell, China is already emerged. It's a leader when it comes to technology, but there's still a lot of issues. There's a divide in China between the big cities and the countryside. I travel a lot in China. I've been to almost all provinces, and I've seen people still living in caves. And very simple conditions, even leaving Beijing or Shanghai and you drive like 2 hours, right, and you're in a different world. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think China has one big advantage, of course, is a top-down approach, a very long-term orientation. In the West, there's always changes in government. There's not like this long-term vision. In China, there's the famous Museum on the Future in Shanghai, where you can see how the future will look like. You can't find similar things in Europe, where you usually, look back into the glory of the past. So yeah, I'm very China bullish. The current crisis in America is helping China, and there have initiatives like One Belt, One Road, reaching out in infrastructure, helping countries in Central Asia, even in Europe. Italy, for example, joined the One Belt, One Road initiative to the kind of dismay of the European Union. We see other countries in Eastern Europe almost under Chinese control when it comes to investments. We see that China is very much playing with soft power. Even the media and the film industry, we have a lot of Chinese productions. So it's no longer just the American taste, but also the Chinese taste.
So in terms of the connection maybe between China and other emerging markets, do you see now a trend? There has been a lot of discussion over the years, and maybe it was more academic, about when it comes to models of development, for example, that, well, the Western, the Anglo-Saxon model is maybe not as attractive anymore. The Washington Consensus certainly took a huge hit after the 2008 financial crisis. Do you see a trend of the up and coming countries maybe gravitating a little bit more towards a China-like developmental model, especially since a lot of those emerging markets are, as you mentioned, wrapped up in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, definitely, Anglo-Saxon capitalism, which is usually, short-term oriented, is giving way to more Asian approach. And if I say Asian approach, it started already in the 1950s with Japan. At the time, the famous MITI in Japan, the Ministry of Commerce and Planning, they basically created a model where the state is heavy-handedly investing in certain industries, pushing exports, also forcing foreign companies to set up joint ventures, technology transfer, and then over a while, kind of changing the model where their own companies reaching out and export and become heavyweights on their own. And the Koreans follow this model, the Taiwanese, then the so-called four tigers in Southeast Asia, and finally also China. So this is happening, and we see also more and more state intervention in Europe. Continental European countries also leave the kind of Anglo-Saxon model and have more state intervention. That's happening. But what's also happening is quite interesting, is that Chinese companies actually, they more and more use American Western models of management on the corporate level. And, capitalism is omnipresent in China. It's no longer socialism, as we know. And maybe the Chinese are the best capitalists in the world. They are entrepreneurs. They have entrepreneurship in their DNA. We see it also in Russia. Russia is a very capitalist country when it comes to the initiatives of entrepreneurs setting up ventures and having and trying, to be on their own and even apart from government. So you see both trends. Yes, the state is intervening, but the entrepreneurs want to have freedom, and for them, the world is big. It's not only their own country, but Chinese entrepreneurs you can find all over the world. Usually they go for a double listing, maybe back in Shanghai and Shenzhen, and then go also to the New York Stock Exchange. It's capitalism at its best.
So it's interesting. You sort of highlight sort of the combination of, I guess it sounds like, state capitalism and entrepreneurial dynamism. I'm wondering if sort of in the context of COVID-19, if you look at the emerging market landscape, do you see that some of those emerging markets are focusing now more on state capitalism, or to what extent are they also laying the foundation for more entrepreneurship? The reason I'm asking this, there was a report on Channel News Asia out of Singapore recently, and Singapore, I guess, according to MSCI index, was still classified as an emerging market, even though it's a very developed country. But they had an interesting report about how COVID-19 also opened new opportunities for entrepreneurship. So do you have a sense of the kind of entrepreneurial dynamism that is happening in emerging markets? Is it being facilitated, or are there some roadblocks that are still hampering it?
Well, yes, definitely governments try to nurture entrepreneurship and innovation. A very good example is Vietnam. Vietnam is also on the winning side with COVID. Even prior to COVID, a lot of Western companies relocated their manufacturing site from China to Vietnam for cost reasons. Also because they have much better access to young, well-educated engineers. One region we are working with, and you attended our last Asia meeting, Francis, is the region of Ben Tseng, north of Ho Chi Minh City. And for them, entrepreneurship is really the mantra. Would like to attract their own young people to set up ventures, but they attract also foreign direct investment in a very big way. And they might, emulate the success of Shenzhen and, the southern Chinese special development zones. And it's a lot of fine tuning, how much kind of guidance are you giving to the entrepreneurs, putting infrastructure in place, then also, but also the grassroots development. So it's top down and bottom up. And I think you need both. Even the Silicon Valley, developed like that initially. The defense ministry, Pentagon, invested a lot in Silicon Valley. It has to do with military technology and later on chips for computers. And only then, the tech giants like Apple and later on Facebook came up. So you need a certain level of state intervention. We see it also in Africa. By the way, I'm very Africa bullish, talking about emerging markets. Africa really is a new frontier. You see fantastic entrepreneurial success in certain countries. Take Rwanda, for example. Rwanda, of course, is a very controlled economy on the one hand, but also one which is really nurturing entrepreneurship. Or take a place like Ghana. Ghana is a bit like the new Switzerland of Europe. So the governments in both countries try to put the kind of frameworks, maybe in a Singaporean style, putting the right conditions, for taxes, for infrastructure, for living conditions, but then let it, leave it to the entrepreneurs to really, go and run yourself.
It's interesting that you should mention Africa, actually, since I'm actually this semester in my home university teaching a course on African history and politics, and we will also focus on emerging markets and that the concept there. And Rwanda is going to be one of the case studies that we are using. I'm using the book Rwanda Inc. And there's a very interesting book that came out last year in 2020 called Africa First, about how to ignite the growth engine. So a lot of the points that you mentioned are discussed in there. But sticking with Africa then for a moment, Africa might be home to a lot more of the maybe so-called frontier markets as well. So obviously there's a lot of potential for Africa. What do you see as the likely hurdles or challenges that might still prevent some of those countries from fully capitalizing on their latent potential in Africa?
Right. First of all, I should say that Africa is good news. Just think about, the new free trade zone in Africa, which just started actually 11 days ago on the 1st of January. The Secretary General of this new African free trade zone attended our last Horasis meeting, and it's amazing. Think about the 55 countries in Africa now, one big economic bloc. The big hindrance so far was that there was no kind of unified or united market. Even flight connections were so bad. When you fly from A to B, sometimes you have to fly back to London or Paris. I experienced myself in the last 3 years. I traveled to around 35 African countries, and I've been to Africa before. I think only 3 or 4 countries are missing now. I always went, strategically, like 6, 7 countries in a row, and planning flight connection was so difficult. Meaning, there's no connection, and sometimes the border areas are even dangerous. Think about what's happening in the Sahel zone, in the area between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. It's a land not controlled by anybody. The second big challenge, is still corruption and the rule of law. In some countries, it's not really working, and there's so many people always asking for something from the left to the right. But there are great exceptions. I've been last December to a country which is barely visited. I've been to Benin, or Benin in French, just north of Nigeria. And this country is amazing. I think many people even don't know where it is. But it's I would say almost corruption free. They're building now an infrastructure. They build 5-star hotels, and there's a very natural transition of power, from one to the other without like a coup d'etat in between. So there are a lot of bright spots. And one big advantage of Africa, obviously, is the demographic dividend. A lot of young people. And the missing of formal employment opportunities means that those young people are kind of forced to become entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship sometimes comes from this need to survive. So you go for the last mile and you just decide to build your own company, and it's happening now in Africa. You see it everywhere.
Right. And then it's interesting. We will highlight a lot of the themes that you just mentioned in our course as we go forward as well. The corruption would be a big one, certainly. Some of the success stories in Africa we will highlight when it comes to technology. We see a lot of technology leapfrogging. I think that's a thing that a lot of emerging markets are sort of benefiting from. Kenya, the big case study that's always being proposed there in academic circles seems to be M-Pesa, the mobile payment system. If you had to look at sort of the emerging and frontier market landscape in general, would you dare make a prediction as to what you think would be the next sort of breakout countries that we should be really focusing on, the ones with the biggest potential?
Right. It's difficult to highlight one or a few. Do you mean in the African context or in
overall, anywhere in the world? If you just look at emerging markets in general.
Right. Yeah. So Africa. There are a lot of candidates. You mentioned already Rwanda. We mentioned Ghana. Smaller places like Benin as well. Even like big countries like Nigeria, which have gigantic problems, corruption, but also, being a country with so many different beliefs, people and tribes and unity. But, the country has immense potential. If they get it right, this country will be a star, but it's still some way to go. If we just change continents for a moment, Latin America has always been an underrated continent. And people say, oh, they've gone from crisis to crisis, there's hope in between. And just at the point, when they reach a level of development, there's another big crisis. And, Argentina has been in crisis for I think 100 years now, right? And Argentina at one point was the richest country on earth. It was like Dubai 100 years ago, where everybody went, right, and said, let's create this, and you see what happened. But in Latin America, there are some places also with huge potential. Colombia, for example. I think they're really at the tipping point. I'm not sure, friend, if you've been to Medellin recently. Medellin, the connotation tells us it's all about narcotics and their main export product is illegal. But it's something of the past. Nowadays, Medellin is a bit of a Silicon Valley where even, young Europeans and young Americans go because it's so dynamic. So there are pockets of development of potential, even in Latin America, Asia, and we are both old Asia hands, so to say, and we lived in Asia. Of course, Asia is a no-brainer. There's so many interesting countries coming up. Vietnam, we mentioned already. Some countries have difficulties over the years. Philippines was like up and down, and there are also, of course, governance issues. But Philippines got also great potential in the future. Um, Likewise, Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia is a very large country, but if they get it right, also a lot of potential. So all work in Asia. Personally, I'm a fan of small countries, small nations. I'm based in Switzerland, and I look always into small nations because you can basically do so many things in a small country. And take Singapore, what they did. That started like 40, 50 years ago with Lee Kuan Yew. Basically, at the time, it was just a big swamp, and there was no infrastructure, and they made it. And I think many countries now use the Singapore example of how to leapfrog, even in a smaller country.
Since we haven't really focused too much on Latin America, but since you brought it up, I think one of the countries that, and I liked your point about focusing maybe on smaller countries. Those are usually the ones that might be actually overlooked in the process, because we always seem to gravitate towards the bigger ones. When we think of, for example, the BRICS term, or BRIC as it was initially called in 2000 by William O'Neill of Goldman Sachs, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then they threw in South Africa later. If you look at Brazil, I think that fits that sort of description that you had, that the perception seems to be from a lot of people that in Latin America, we just sort of gravitate from crisis to crisis. And Brazil, I mean, I guess it still deserves a lot of attention because it obviously has potential. It has a technology sector, it has natural resources, it has a large population, although a lot of them are still in poverty. But Brazil has been maybe, and I would like to get your take on this if I could. Do you feel it has been overhyped in the past? There was an interesting book I read once that was titled Brazil's Second Chance. And one of the lines in the book was that Brazil is the land of the future, and it will always be so. So in a way, the potential is there, but for some odd reason, they never can actually capitalize on the strengths they have, because something is holding them back, whether it's institutional weaknesses, corruption. With the car wash scandal is just the latest one that we heard, coming out of Brazil. How do you feel about Brazil going forward?
Personally, I love the country. Of course, it's a great culture, great music, great food, and most importantly, great people. But you're right. Brazil so far was always, the dream, the country of the future. The possibility, but it really didn't happen. Even so, there are pockets of excellence. Take a company like Embraer, manufacturing planes and smaller planes, and they are the market leader in what they do. So it's possible. And they got their own big, domestic market, which is a huge advantage. They got, of course, the Amazonas area with forestry. So it's an amazing country. I think the main problem of Brazil is that they always shift from the left to the right in terms of politics. And I mean like the extreme left and the extreme right. But there's nothing like, in between. You go from one extreme to the other. And that's dramatic. How can you govern a country on the long term, when you always go to the extreme? So I'm a fan of the middle way, in a very Asian concept, right? It's just to go avoiding the extremes when it comes to economic policy. You can't say today, you are nationalizing industries, and then, we go into kind of Manchester or Chicago type of capitalism in 1 second, right? It doesn't work. And what Brazil really failed to do is to bring wealth to the masses and to bridge the divide. There are incredibly wealthy people in Brazil. But then, people live in favelas. And, what I've seen on my trips to Brazil and other Latin American countries, you have a street. On the one side, you go to favelas, and on the other side, the villas. And it's just one street in between. It's striking, right? And yeah, they have to get it right. And they need people at the top whose main intention and main vision is to bring wealth to the people. And then I think Brazil and other Latin American countries can really thrive.
So maybe as a closing comment, because I know your time is precious, the point that you just made about Brazil, so the divide, the inequality, sort of side by side, the haves and the have-nots. I think that sort of allows us to nicely sort of complete the circle and come back to China, what you initially started with. When we look at emerging markets, there's a lot of, economic growth potential. And of course, everybody expects that, I'm going to cash in on that economic growth. My standard of living will increase as well. But the challenge, of course, is always that not everybody will benefit or reap the rewards early on. It's as the late Deng Xiaoping had said, right? It's okay for some people to get rich first. And that might be okay as long as you can ensure that down the road, the current have-nots will actually enjoy the fruits of their labor as well. And I think that is something to keep in mind with when we look at emerging markets in terms of we want to look at the long-term potential. Then the policies, are they geared towards eventual redistribution of wealth, or are they pursuing an inclusive development agenda? So I think you gave us a very concise, very quick, and yet very compelling global overview in a way. So I appreciate that. If you have any last minute comments, feel free to share those. Otherwise, we might close this conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Francis. I very much enjoyed the discussion, and I agree with you in your conclusion. Also, again, portraying China. When Deng Xiaoping had his famous trip to the south, the Shenzhen, some 30 years ago, actually now 40 years ago, he basically said that we need a more capitalist mindset, and if you don't have entrepreneurs, right, we have nothing to share. China was able to bring wealth to everybody. You can't really see such divide like in Latin America in China. It's a very kind of balanced society. But on the future, one last thought I want to share is that we might actually enter a phase of high growth, what I would like to call the Roaring Twenties. Similar to the Roaring Twenties 100 years ago. After the First World War, we had the Spanish flu, as you know, and it was a disaster. And we lost so many million of people, actually many more than in the war. But after that, the world started to move very fast. It was actually like a renaissance, with big cities booming, investment booming, entrepreneurship booming, stock exchanges going up. The Roaring Twenties, also in terms of capital, in terms of culture, music, and the arts. But then something happened. There's been a lot of excesses. We went too far. And then we went into the Great Depression of the late 1920s. So I hope we can avoid it this time with a bit more of foresight by the right people leading us. With entrepreneurs, understanding that we have to invest also in the global public good, and not just in our own pockets. I think then we can avoid those excesses, but still reap the benefits of the Roaring Twenties.
Sure, and that is actually a very nice closing comment, because it makes a very good connection to the material that the students will be viewing later today in my video lectures, because I will focus on rapid economic growth as a destabilizing force. So that the reference to the Roaring Twenties, and then we took it too far, is a very nice sort of way to get students to think about the potential is there, but yes, it has to be sort of deliberate growth and inclusive. And I think the reference to entrepreneurship, that might be a topic that a lot of students may want to explore. What is the entrepreneurial capacity? What is the entrepreneurial opportunities that exist in emerging markets, or how do governments go about actually laying the foundation for that? So I appreciate your insights, and especially taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. I'm sure that the students will enjoy watching this interview, and I'm sure I'll get a lot of interesting comments from students. So once again, Frank, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Francis. Good talking to you, and wish you a good interaction with your students later on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. So